I was 68 when my daughter sent a message that erased me from her life in 12 words. No warning, no argument, just a sentence that told me we were finished and that I should never look for them again. In that instant, I was no longer a mother, no longer a grandmother, just a problem to be removed. What I did not know then was that the message was only the beginning. Behind those words was a plan that could have cost me everything I had built. And before I understood the truth, I had to survive the silence. Before we step into today's story, drop a quick comment and let us know where you're joining us from. We're always amazed by how these stories connect people across different cultures and places. Your voice in the comments keeps this community alive, so do not hold back. And if you are new here, hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you will always be the first to catch our latest tales. Now, sit back, relax, and let us dive in. My name is Evelyn Carter. I am 68 years old, and I live in a quiet house overlooking the marshlands of Charleston, South Carolina. The tides move in and out behind my backyard like they have for decades, slow and patient, never in a hurry. I have lived in this house for 32 years. My husband and I signed the mortgage when we were still young enough to believe we had all the time in the world. We paid it off the year before he died. Thomas passed away 4 years ago from a sudden heart attack in our kitchen. One moment he was rinsing blueberries for breakfast, the next he was on the floor, and my life split cleanly in two. After the funeral, I kept going because that is what women like me do. I had owned Sweet Harbor Bakery for 35 years. I woke up at 4 every morning, tied my apron, and built something that fed half this neighborhood. I sold the bakery a year after Thomas died. I told everyone I was ready to rest. The truth was, the ovens felt too loud without him waiting at home. My daughter, Lauren Whitmore, lives in Atlanta, Georgia. She is 38, a real estate attorney with sharp suits and a sharper schedule. She married Mark Whitmore, who talks about investments the way other men talk about sports. They have 2 children, Sophie and Noah, who used to run into my arms during visits like I was the safest place in the world. Sunday evening video calls became our ritual after they moved away. I would sit at the same kitchen table, propping my phone against the sugar bowl, watching my grandchildren lose teeth and show me school art projects. The calls grew shorter over the past year, but I told myself that was simply life. The morning it happened was unremarkable. A Monday, humid air pressing against the windows. I poured my coffee and carried it to the table. My phone buzzed against the wood. I expected a grocery coupon or a weather alert. Instead, I saw my daughter's name. "We are done with you. Do not ever look for us again." I read it once, then again, then a third time, as if the letters might rearrange themselves into something kinder. My hand began to tremble, not violently, just enough to make the coffee ripple inside the mug. I called her immediately. The call went straight to voicemail. I sent a reply asking what was wrong. The message did not deliver. I opened social media. Her profile was gone. So were the photographs of my grandchildren. The kitchen clock grew louder with every second. I sat down slowly, the chair scraping against the tile floor. I tried to remember our last conversation. Had I criticized something? Had I forgotten a birthday? My mind searched for a mistake like it was sifting flour for hidden lumps. I found nothing. The marsh outside shimmered under the late summer sun, indifferent to what had just happened inside my home. A boat engine hummed somewhere in the distance. The world had not shifted, yet something fundamental inside me had. Do not ever look for us again. The words echoed in the silence, not anger, not even grief yet, just a hollow disbelief, as though someone had quietly removed the floor beneath my feet. By the time my coffee turned cold, I understood one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever had just begun with that message would divide my life into before and after, and I had no idea which version of myself would survive it. If you are still watching and that message hits you as hard as it hit me, comment number 1 below so I know you are right here with me. Now, let us uncover what I started to notice in the weeks before everything fell apart. I did not sleep the night after the message. I lay in my bed staring at the ceiling fan as it turned in slow circles, listening to the distant hum of insects outside the window. Every hour or so I reached for my phone on the nightstand, half expecting the words to disappear, half hoping I had imagined them. They were still there each time I looked. By morning, the shock had dulled into something colder and more focused. Grief makes you search for meaning. I began replaying the past 6 months in my mind, as though I were rewinding security footage. At first, nothing seemed unusual. Lauren had always been ambitious. Her work as a real estate attorney in Atlanta kept her busy. But as I sifted through the details, small moments rose to the surface. She had started asking about my finances more often, not in a blunt way. It was usually wrapped in concern. She would ask whether I had updated my will. She wondered if I had reviewed my homeowner's insurance. Once, she asked where I kept the original deed to the house. At the time, I felt flattered that she was thinking ahead. I told myself she was being responsible. Then there were her suggestions about simplifying my life. She mentioned a senior community outside Atlanta with walking trails and social activities. She said it would be easier for everyone if I lived closer. I laughed it off. I loved Charleston. I loved the marsh view, the familiar grocery store, the women from church who knew how I took my tea. Still, her tone had shifted. It carried urgency rather than affection. Mark began appearing more frequently on our calls. He would lean into the camera and talk about market conditions. He explained how home equity could be leveraged. He said money should never sit idle. Once he remarked that my house was an untapped asset. I remember smiling politely while feeling something tighten in my chest. I told myself it was just a generational difference in thinking. Young families had different pressures. 2 weeks before the message arrived, I received a letter from my bank asking me to confirm a digital profile update. I assumed it was routine. I had not changed anything, but mistakes happen. A few days later, another envelope arrived, requesting verification of a recent inquiry about my property tax history. I placed it on the counter and forgot about it. I had never been careless with paperwork, yet grief and routine can dull vigilance. On the 3rd morning after the text, I opened a drawer in my home office and began pulling out old folders. The file cabinet smelled faintly of dust and paper. I searched for anything that might connect these scattered pieces. Tucked between medical records and insurance documents, I found a folder labeled Power of Attorney. 5 years earlier, before gallbladder surgery, I had signed a financial power of attorney naming Lauren as my agent in case something happened to me. It was meant to be temporary, precautionary. I remember signing it in a hospital waiting room, telling myself it was just paperwork. After I recovered, I never thought about it again. I never revoked it. I sat back in my chair and stared at the document. The authority it granted was broad: access to financial accounts, authority to manage property, the kind of access you only give someone you trust without question. A new thought formed, slow and deliberate. What if the message was not only about anger? What if distance served a purpose? If I were isolated, cut off from conversation, from explanation, from reassurance, who would question decisions made in my name? The shock that had hollowed me out began to fill with something steadier. Not rage, not yet. Clarity. I folded the document carefully and placed it on the desk. Tomorrow, I decided, I would go to the bank in person. If you are still with me, and you can feel the warning signs building, comment number 2 below to let me know you are paying attention. Now, let us see what happened when I walked into the bank. The next morning, I dressed more carefully than usual. I chose a navy blouse with small pearl buttons and pressed slacks, the kind I used to wear when meeting suppliers at the bakery. I brushed my hair back and applied a touch of lipstick. If I was walking into something difficult, I would not look uncertain doing it. I slipped the power of attorney document into my handbag and stepped outside. The marsh shimmered under the early light, calm and indifferent. I wished I felt the same. The local bank branch sat on the corner of Broad Street, red brick with white trim, familiar as the grocery store and the church pew I had occupied for decades. I had deposited bakery earnings there for 35 years. The young teller at the front desk recognized me and smiled. I returned it, though my chest felt tight. I asked to speak with the branch manager about recent account notifications. He invited me into his office, a small room with framed photographs of community events on the walls. We had known each other casually for years. I explained that I had received letters referencing digital updates and property inquiries I did not initiate. He turned his computer screen slightly toward himself and began searching. The silence stretched longer than I expected. His expression shifted from neutral to concentrated. He cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. There is an active application for a home equity line of credit tied to your property, he said carefully. For a moment, I thought I had misheard him. My house has no mortgage, I replied. We paid it off years ago. He nodded. This would not replace that. It is a new line of credit secured by the home as collateral. The application was filed 2 weeks ago through our Atlanta branch. The room seemed to narrow around me. I felt the blood rush to my ears. Who filed it? I asked. The CO applicant is listed as Lauren Whitmore. I held my handbag tighter in my lap. I did not sign anything, I said. He turned the screen toward me. The documentation reflected authorization granted under an existing financial power of attorney. The signature block showed that Lauren Whitmore was acting as my legal agent. The amount requested was substantial, well into the six-figure range. The stated purpose read investment restructuring. My breath slowed into something deliberate. She did not forge my name. She did not need to. I had given her authority years ago in a hospital waiting room, trusting that it would only be used if I were incapacitated. Has the loan been approved? I asked. Not yet, he answered. It is an underwriting review. Funds have not been disbursed. A strange mixture of relief and dread washed over me. The house I had lived in for 32 years was being positioned as leverage for something I did not understand. If approved, the debt would attach to my home. If payments were missed, consequences would follow. The marsh behind my backyard had always symbolized stability. Now I imagined paperwork tightening around the foundation like a net. The manager explained that I could revoke the power of attorney, but the revocation would need to be executed properly and recorded. Until that happened, the authorization remained valid. His tone was cautious, respectful, but unmistakably clear. I thanked him and stood on unsteady legs. Walking out of the bank, the bright Charleston sun felt harsher than usual. Traffic moved normally. People crossed the street carrying shopping bags. No one else knew that my home had nearly been turned into collateral without my consent. This was not an emotional outburst from my daughter. It was not a misunderstanding that could be softened over coffee. The text message that severed contact now made a different kind of sense. Distance was useful. Silence prevented questions. As I sat in my car, staring at the steering wheel, the truth settled with a cold precision. This was not anger. This was strategy. If you are still watching and that discovery shocked you, comment number 3 below so I know you are standing with me. Now let us take this where it had to go next. I did not call Lauren after leaving the bank. Every instinct in me wanted to demand an explanation, to ask how she could use my name and my home without telling me. But something steadier held me back. If this was strategy, emotion would only serve the other side. Instead, the following morning, I packed a folder with every document I had found and drove south toward Savannah, Georgia. The coastal highway stretched ahead in long, flat lines. Marshland slowly gave way to thicker trees as I crossed state lines. The drive took just under 2 hours, but it felt like a quiet crossing into a different version of my life. I kept the power of attorney document on the passenger seat, glancing at it whenever doubt tried to creep in. I had signed it. That part was true, but I had never intended for it to be used like this. Barbara Holloway's office was housed in a restored brick building near the historic district. The sign outside was simple, without flash or polished glass. Inside, shelves of legal volumes lined the walls, and framed photographs of former clients filled a narrow hallway. Barbara herself was in her late 60s, silver hair cut short, posture straight, eyes observant but not unkind. She greeted me with a handshake that felt steady. I told her everything: the text message, the blocked calls, the bank discovery, the pending line of credit. I placed the power of attorney on her desk and watched her read it carefully, page by page. She asked precise questions, never interrupting the flow of my explanation. When I finished, she folded her hands and explained the situation in clear terms. The document was valid. Until revoked, it granted Lauren authority to act on my behalf in financial matters. Using it to apply for a line of credit was technically within scope. However, she reminded me that an agent under a power of attorney carries a fiduciary duty, meaning every action must be taken solely in the principal's best interest. She leaned back slightly and asked whether anything else unusual had occurred. I mentioned the bank notifications and the distance that followed the message. That was when she paused and turned to her computer. Within minutes, she located a preliminary filing in an Atlanta court referencing a request for financial capacity evaluation. It was not a full guardianship petition yet, but it was the first procedural step. The air in the room shifted. If I were declared financially incompetent, Lauren could petition for legal control over my assets beyond the power of attorney. The text message now carried a different weight. Isolation could weaken my credibility. Silence could make it easier to argue that I was confused or unstable. Barbara outlined the immediate steps. We would draft and execute a formal revocation of the power of attorney and file it with the appropriate county offices. We would notify the bank in writing and demand suspension of the loan application. We would begin a documented record of every communication and transaction. Most importantly, she advised me not to confront Lauren yet. Confrontation without preparation could escalate matters prematurely. As I left her office that afternoon, the sun over Savannah felt sharper, more defined. The betrayal hurt more deeply now that I understood its structure. This was not about a disagreement. It was about leverage and control. Driving back toward Charleston, I realized something inside me had shifted. Grief had carried me through widowhood, but this required something else. I would not be passive in my own story. If you are still here and you sense this is about to escalate, comment number 4 below to stay with the story. Now let us move into the moment that changed the balance completely. When I returned to Charleston from Savannah, my house no longer felt fragile. It felt watched, measured, evaluated. I stood in the foyer for a long moment before setting down my handbag, listening to the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant rush of wind through the marsh grass. For days, I had felt as though the ground beneath me was giving way. Now, for the first time, I sensed something solid forming again. I walked slowly through each room. The kitchen where Thomas had fallen. The dining table where I once spread bakery invoices late at night. The back porch where I watched thunderstorms roll in across the water. If Lauren believed this house was my only real asset, she had misunderstood me more than I realized. That night, I opened the safe in my bedroom closet and pulled out a separate folder labeled Harbor Collective. 20 years earlier, When Sweet Harbor Bakery was thriving, I had quietly joined a private investment group formed by several women entrepreneurs in Charleston. We met once a quarter in the upstairs room of a bookstore on King Street. No fanfare, no headlines, just disciplined pooling of capital into private equity ventures and long-term holdings. I invested a portion of the bakery profits over time, modestly at first, then more consistently after we paid down our mortgage. Thomas knew about the group, but he never involved himself deeply. He respected that it was something I chose on my own. Lauren, however, had never shown much interest in those conversations when she was younger. To her, the bakery had been the family business. She never asked what I did with the surplus beyond college savings and household expenses. After selling the bakery, I had rolled the proceeds directly into the Harbor Collective portfolio. I rarely spoke of it because I did not see wealth as something to announce. It was security, quiet, deliberate security. I logged into the online portal and waited for the account summary to load. The number on the screen was higher than I had last remembered, just over $9 million in diversified holdings, private equity stakes, long-term bonds, real estate partnerships outside South Carolina. Growth accumulated over 2 decades of careful stewardship. The structure of the portfolio was held inside a trust I established 2 years ago during routine estate planning. It was separate from my primary checking accounts and not directly accessible through the old power of attorney document. For several minutes, I simply stared at the screen. The fear that had pressed against my ribs since the text message began to loosen. If Lauren believed my house was the foundation of my financial life, she was operating with incomplete information. I called Barbara the following morning and informed her of the investment structure. She listened carefully, then explained that assets held within the trust would require far more effort to challenge or leverage. The power of attorney would not automatically grant access. Her tone shifted slightly, not triumphant, but strategic. "This changes the balance," she said. And it did. I was no longer reacting to an attempt to corner me. I had options. I had leverage. More importantly, I had clarity. This was not about desperation on my part. It might, however, reflect desperation elsewhere. Barbara suggested that instead of escalating immediately, we arrange a controlled meeting in Atlanta. It would be framed as a financial review discussion. Calm, documented, structured. When I ended the call, I stepped onto the back porch. The marsh stretched out under a pale blue sky. The tide was turning, water slowly reclaiming the banks it had abandoned hours earlier. For the first time since that text arrived, I felt something steadier than hurt, prepared. Atlanta's skyline rose in sheets of glass and steel against a pale gray morning. I had not visited Lauren's office in years. The building stood taller than I remembered, its lobby polished to a shine that reflected every movement like a mirror. I arrived with Barbara at my side, dressed in a charcoal suit that felt more like armor than clothing. My hands were steady. My heartbeat was not. Lauren greeted us in a conference room overlooking the city. Mark was already seated at the far end of the long table, scrolling through his phone. Lauren's expression carried polite impatience, the kind reserved for administrative inconveniences. She seemed surprised to see Barbara, but masked it quickly. I introduced Barbara as my attorney. The temperature in the room shifted without anyone raising their voice. Lauren began outlining what she described as routine financial adjustments. She referenced the home equity line of credit as a strategic move, something that would benefit the family long term. Mark nodded occasionally, eyes fixed on the table. Barbara waited until Lauren finished. Then she placed a thin stack of documents in front of them. The first was the formal revocation of the power of attorney, executed and recorded in South Carolina. The second detailed the pending loan application and its suspension. The third was a copy of the preliminary filing, requesting evaluation of my financial competency. The words on those pages felt heavier than the silence in the room. Barbara explained calmly that while the power of attorney had been valid, any action taken under it carried a fiduciary obligation. Leveraging my primary residence without consultation could constitute breach of duty. Initiating an inquiry into my competency without medical basis could be interpreted as coercive. Lauren's composure began to fracture. She insisted the steps were precautionary. Mark leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, expression tightening. I listened to them as one might listen to distant traffic. My focus was elsewhere. When there was a pause, I spoke. "There is something you both do not know," I said. I described the Harbor Collective Investment Group, the 20 years of disciplined contributions, the trust structure established 2 years ago, the current valuation exceeding $9 million, assets diversified and insulated from the authority previously granted. Lauren stared at me as if recalibrating an equation. Mark's silence deepened. "The house in Charleston is not my only security," I continued, "nor is it my most significant asset. What you attempted to leverage represents a fraction of what I have built." The words were not spoken in anger. They were spoken as fact. Barbara outlined the choice plainly. The guardianship inquiry would be withdrawn immediately. The loan application would be formally canceled in writing. A written acknowledgement of overreach would be provided, and we would enter family counseling under neutral supervision. If these conditions were not met, a complaint would be filed with the Georgia State Bar regarding professional misconduct, along with civil proceedings. The room grew still. Outside the window, cars moved through the city as though nothing had shifted inside that glass enclosure. I looked at Lauren then, not as an adversary, but as the child I once carried into kindergarten, clutching my hand. "I did not come here to destroy you," I said quietly. "I came here to stop you." Her eyes filled, though she did not cry. Mark avoided my gaze entirely. I stood before anyone else moved. The meeting was over. Whatever version of our relationship existed before that text message had dissolved. What remained would have to be rebuilt, if it could be rebuilt at all. As I walked out of the building, the Atlanta air felt different from the morning. Not lighter, not heavier, simply clear. If you are still watching after that confrontation, comment number 6 below, so I know you made it through the hardest part. Now, let us see what the fallout revealed in Chapter 7. The official confirmations arrived 3 days after the meeting in Atlanta. I was sitting at my kitchen table in Charleston when the email notifications appeared, followed by overnight envelopes stamped with corporate letterheads. The home equity application had been formally withdrawn. The underwriting file was closed. The preliminary inquiry regarding my financial capacity had been dismissed before further action. The language in the documents was clean and procedural. No admission of wrongdoing, no explanation, just confirmation that nothing would proceed. I read each page carefully, smoothing them against the table as though flattening wrinkles from fabric. My house was no longer encumbered. My name was no longer attached to a question of competence. On paper, everything had been restored. Inside me, nothing felt restored. The marsh outside the kitchen window looked exactly as it had the morning I received the text message. Tides moved in and out. Egrets stalked the shallow water. The world had resumed its rhythm, but the air inside my chest felt heavier than before. Relief is not the same as peace. Safety is not the same as trust. Lauren did not contact me immediately. 4 days passed in silence. I did not reach out either. For the first time in my life, I understood that space can be both protective and painful. When her call finally came, her voice sounded thinner than I remembered. She did not argue. She did not accuse. She told me that Mark had been under pressure for months. Several commercial real estate projects had stalled when financing collapsed. Investors were demanding returns. Lines of credit were tightening. He had believed that leveraging my home temporarily would stabilize their position long enough to recover. Temporarily, she said. The word lingered in the air long after she spoke it. Temporary debt still binds. Temporary risk can still destroy. I listened as she explained how conversations had grown tense inside their household. Mark had framed the equity in my home as dormant capital. He had assured her it would be repaid quickly once deals closed. When I resisted moving closer to Atlanta, months earlier, frustration grew. She convinced herself that accessing the power of attorney was not betrayal, but efficiency. I did not interrupt. I did not raise my voice. I simply absorbed what she offered. There is a difference between understanding and excusing. I could understand pressure. I had lived through lean bakery seasons and sleepless nights balancing payroll. But I had never once considered mortgaging my parents' home to survive it. As the call ended, I sat alone at the table for a long time. I saw Lauren not as a villain, but as a woman who allowed fear to distort her judgment. Intelligence does not guarantee integrity. Love does not automatically override ambition. The betrayal now had layers. It was not only financial maneuvering, it was the quiet decision to treat me as an obstacle instead of a person. It was the willingness to question my capacity rather than ask for help openly. That realization hurt more than the loan application ever could. I folded the confirmation letters and placed them back in their envelopes. My house was safe. My finances were intact, but something between my daughter and me had shifted permanently. Trust, once cracked, does not return to its original shape. It must be rebuilt differently, or not at all. For the first time, I accepted that whatever came next would not resemble what we had before. In the weeks that followed the confirmations, I returned to Savannah twice to sit across from Barbara's wide oak desk and untangle every loose thread in my affairs. The revocation of the power of attorney was formally recorded in Charleston and in Atlanta. Certified notices were sent to every financial institution that had ever held my accounts. My trust documents were amended to close vague language that could invite interpretation. Each meeting felt less like damage control and more like construction. Preparation is a quiet kind of power. I realized how much of my life I had entrusted to assumption. I assumed love would prevent overreach. I assumed family would ask before acting. Now, every clause in my estate plan carried clarity. The Harbor collective assets were fully insulated within the trust structure. Distribution terms were spelled out in precise detail. My grandchildren would receive educational support and staged inheritances at defined ages. Lauren's access to anything beyond sentimental items would be contingent upon documented participation in family counseling and a neutral trustee's oversight. I did not design it out of punishment. I designed it out of realism. I also established something new. For years, women in my investment circle had spoken about second chapters. Some rebuilt after divorce, others after widowhood. Many lacked capital to start again. Using a portion of my investment gains, I created a small scholarship fund for women over 50 who wanted to open businesses in coastal South Carolina. It felt right to extend forward instead of clinging backward. Sweet Harbor Bakery had once given me purpose. Perhaps this would give someone else the same. The larger decision took longer. My Charleston house had sheltered my marriage, my grief, and my recent awakening. Every room held memory. The marsh behind it had witnessed the full arc of my adult life. But in the quiet evenings, I began to notice how the walls felt heavier than before. The betrayal had not occurred inside those rooms, yet it lingered there like a shadow. Safety had returned, but innocence had not. I drove to Asheville, North Carolina one weekend, under the pretense of looking at mountain views. The air felt different there, thinner and cooler. I walked through a modest cottage tucked among tall trees and felt something settle in my chest. It was not escape, it was space. Charleston would always be part of me, but it no longer needed to define the rest of my years. When I listed the Marsh house for sale, neighbors expressed surprise. I smiled and told them it was time for a change. On my final evening before the sign went up, I stood on the back porch as the sun slipped low over the water. The tide was out, exposing the muddy banks and tall grass bending in the wind. I thanked the house silently for carrying me this far. Grief had once defined my strength. Now clarity did. I was no longer reacting to crisis. I was shaping my future deliberately, without apology. Whatever relationship I rebuilt with Lauren would exist within boundaries I chose. For the first time since that text message arrived, I felt something close to peace. If you are still with me as everything begins to rebuild, comment number 8 below, so I know you are ready for the final outcome. Now, let us move into the conclusion of this journey. 8 months after the meeting in Atlanta, my life no longer revolved around crisis management. I had settled into my cottage in Asheville, North Carolina, where the mornings smelled of pine and cool earth instead of salt and marsh grass. The mountains rose softly in the distance, steady and unhurried. I developed new routines, walking the wooded trail near my neighborhood at sunrise, attending a small book group at the local library, volunteering twice a week at a community kitchen. My days felt self-directed again. The quiet here was different from Charleston. It did not carry the weight of memory. It carried possibility. Lauren called on a Tuesday afternoon in early spring. Her name on my screen no longer sent a shock through me, but it did still cause a pause. She asked if we could meet somewhere neutral. Greenville, South Carolina was halfway between us. I agreed, not out of urgency, but because I was ready to see what remained. The cafe we chose sat on a corner overlooking a tree-lined street. When I arrived, Lauren was already seated near the window. She looked thinner, her posture less rigid than before. The confidence that once filled every room around her had softened into something quieter. She stood when she saw me, hesitated for a second, then offered a small smile. We sat across from each other with untouched cups of coffee between us. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence was not hostile. It was careful. Lauren began by acknowledging what she had done. She did not frame it as misunderstanding. She called it a mistake born of fear and pride. She described the months of tension at home, the financial pressure from Mark's failed investments, and her decision to treat my assets as a solution rather than as something sacred. She said counseling had forced her to examine not only her actions, but the assumptions beneath them. I listened without interrupting. I had learned that explanations are different from excuses. This time, she did not offer excuses. When she finished, I told her that I forgave her. Forgiveness did not come from forgetting. It came from refusing to let bitterness root itself in me. I also told her that trust would take time. Boundaries would remain. My estate plan would not revert to what it once was. She nodded, as if she expected that. There were no dramatic embraces, no promises to return to the way things were. Instead, we spoke about practical matters, the grandchildren, school schedules, counseling sessions that would continue for now. The conversation moved cautiously, like someone testing the strength of ice before stepping fully onto it. When we stood to leave, Lauren reached for my hand briefly. It was a small gesture, but it carried more humility than any apology could. I squeezed her fingers once and let go. Driving back to Asheville, I felt neither triumph nor sadness. I felt steady. The text message that had once divided my life into before and after had forced me to confront truths I might otherwise have ignored. My relationship with my daughter would never return to its earlier innocence, but perhaps it did not need to. Some bonds survive not because they remain unchanged, but because they adapt to reality. I had lost something. I had gained something else. And that balance, for now, was enough. Mornings in Asheville begin with light filtering softly through the trees. The mountains do not rush the day forward. They rise in quiet layers, steady and patient, as if they have nothing to prove. I sit on my small porch with a cup of coffee and watch the mist lift from the valley below. This is how most of my days begin now. Calm, intentional, mine. Sometimes I still think about the text message that divided my life so cleanly. We are done with you. Do not ever look for us again. I can recite it without hesitation. For a long time, those words felt like a blade. Now they feel more like a fracture line in stone, the place where pressure finally revealed a hidden weakness. My life was never the same after that message, but not in the way I once feared. Growing older in this country often means becoming invisible in subtle ways, especially for women who spent decades building homes instead of resumes. I had owned a bakery, yes, but much of my identity was tied to being a wife and a mother. I trusted quietly. I assumed love would shield me from certain risks. What I learned is that trust without structure is vulnerability. Preparation is not distrust. Documentation is not coldness. Boundaries are not cruelty. They are expressions of self-respect. When Lauren leveraged the power of attorney I had signed years earlier, she acted within legal authority but outside moral clarity. I could have responded with vengeance. I had the financial means and the legal support to pursue consequences that would have reshaped her career permanently. I chose not to, not because I was weak, but because destruction would not have restored what mattered. Wealth, I discovered, is not simply the number in an account. It is the ability to decide who you are when tested. It is the freedom to walk away from conflict without being cornered by fear. It is the power to say no without trembling. Motherhood complicates everything. Loving a child does not mean surrendering your judgment. Children grow into adults with ambitions and flaws of their own. They will make choices you would not make. The hardest lesson for me was understanding that I could forgive Lauren while still redefining the terms of our relationship. Forgiveness did not require returning to blindness. The scholarship fund I created for women over 50 continues to grow quietly. Watching other women build second chapters reminds me that reinvention does not belong only to the young. Strength matures. It deepens. When I look back now, I see the text message as a catalyst rather than a catastrophe. It forced me to examine documents I had ignored. It compelled me to assert control over my future. It stripped away the illusion that love alone protects what we build. My life was never the same. It became more deliberate, more defined, more honest. The mountains outside my porch do not move quickly, but they endure. I have learned to do the same. Some turning points arrive quietly, disguised as loss. A sentence on a screen, a door that closes, a silence that stretches longer than it should. Yet within those moments lies a hidden invitation to reassess, to reclaim, to redefine. Age does not diminish strength. It refines it. Experience does not weaken resolve. It sharpens discernment. When boundaries are drawn with clarity and dignity, they become foundations for a more intentional life. True security is not measured only in dollars, but in preparedness, wisdom, and the courage to stand firm without surrendering compassion. Forgiveness can coexist with accountability. Love can endure without losing self-respect. And sometimes, the very event that feels like an ending becomes the beginning of a stronger chapter. Thank you for spending this time here. If this story resonated with you, Please share your thoughts in the comments and consider following and subscribing for more stories that explore resilience, family, and quiet strength.